Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Katherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Katherine Miller. I'm the founder at the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding in Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And I'm excited to welcome Justine Carino today. She's a licensed mental health counselor with a specialization in anxiety and depression treatment. She brings over 12 years of professional experience to her practice. She operates a group private practice across New York and Connecticut, where she assists individuals, families, and couples in managing emotional challenges, enhancing relationships, and establishing healthier boundaries. Justine hosts the Thoughts from the Couch podcast, and her insights have been featured in prominent media outlets, including Cosmopolitan, The Huffington Post, and News 12 Westchester. She's a sought-after speaker for major companies like Eileen Fisher and Lockheed Martin and has appeared on more than 40 podcasts. Welcome, Justine. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, Katherine. I am so excited to be here with you and have this conversation with you today.
Well, I'm really interested in this because I think that anxiety and depression are really common features for people who are thinking about or facing divorce in some way, shape, or form. And so I wonder if that's your experience also. What do you think are some of the most common emotional challenges for individuals and families facing divorce?
It's a great question. Yes to anxiety and depression. And for someone going through divorce, I kind of frame it under really the 5 stages of grief, right? I mean, the 5 stages of grief were first created for people with terminal illness, that they knew they were dying, right? And then we applied it to people that have lost a loved one, the stages they go through. And then we realized there's huge life transitions we go through where we're also grieving. And I think in divorce, we grieve the marriage. We grieve the life we once had with our partner and what that looked like. We grieve that stability. So a lot of the individuals I work with, either in a one-to-one therapy context or couples or family work, every member is grieving in some way. And with those stages of grief, we get a lot of denial, right? We can't believe this is happening. We get a lot of bargaining. I'll do anything to keep it this way if we're the person that didn't want the divorce, right? Or we could bargain and say, please change this other person so this can work. And I'm so frustrated that we can't change, right? There's anger. There's a lot of depression, right? And then there's also this acceptance that eventually comes. And these stages aren't really linear. They can come and go fluidly through time. It's not like you complete one stage and graduate to the other. You could cycle through these over and over again. And then eventually was created the 6th stage of grief, which a lot of people view as anxiety, right? And people going through divorce have a ton of depression and anxiety as a result. Managing all of the feelings and thoughts about what is going to happen, what is my future going to look like as a single person or a single parent, right? There's so many things that come up that we just can worry and worry and worry about and then be sad about because there is such significant loss with divorce.
Yeah, Justine, I think that one of the things, and you touched on this, that people are grieving is the loss of who they are, right? Like, I think when you've been married, and I don't mean married like for a year and a half, I mean, married 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, right? Your own identity is really tied up in your family. And the realization and the reforming of that sense of self is hard and sad. And whether or not you wanted it or not, introduces a whole lot of emotional stuff, some of which could be not some of these sort of what we think of as negative emotions, but you could feel free, gleeful, relieved, and at the same time guilty, right, or shamed. And so I think that's really confusing for people. Is that something that you see in your practice?
Absolutely. It's a tremendous identity shift, right? We have to form a new identity in this new space post-divorce or even during separation. And your whole foundation gets thrown upside down. And there's these little habits we don't even realize we have. Maybe it's you're driving home from work and you're used to calling your partner to talk about the day or check in, and you go to make that call and you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is such a habit and I don't want to do this anymore and we're not supposed to be doing this anymore. And who do I call now, right? Those little things. Or, you pull into the driveway and both kids are asleep in the car and you don't have the partner to help, and you have to pick which kid am I carrying in first and which kid's going to stay in this cold car and wait for me to come back. That moment of I'm a single parent by myself doing this half the time or most of the time, whatever it looks like. So there's these little tiny moments that constantly remind you of how much has changed, how much you didn't even realize your life was entangled with this other person, even if you hated them, right? There are some divorces, you can't stand that person. Maybe this divorce is the best thing to happen to you, right? But there's still a shift that you have to work through.
Absolutely. As you're talking, I'm thinking about I've had a number of women clients over the years. Now, we represent half men and half women, so it's not like our practice is all women, but I've only really noticed this with women clients who'll say, my ex is calling me to talk about his new relationship. And I really don't to do that, but like I'm the best friend. I'm the person he's been coming to with all the issues in his life for 25 years, and now he's having a little bit of trouble finding someone else to talk to about that. But that's really uncomfortable for me. Do you ever see
Oh,
something like
yeah.
that?
Oh, totally. Just these like small habits. I've seen it all, right? I've had people share kids. I've had people share dogs. I've had people continue to share apartments. There's all these different like things that keep being shared. And maybe it's a shared companionship, a shared friendship. Like you're my person that I tell all this to. And sometimes people are okay with it, but I think most of the time people learn that they can't be so okay with it because of if they really want to launch into their next phase, they might have to set up some more boundaries between them and this person. And that's sad too, right? To let go of a friendship perhaps on top of a romantic relationship.
Absolutely. I think sometimes that's the hardest part, right? That this
Yeah.
isn't a good intimacy. And if you hate the person, as you were talking about before, then you're not going to feel like that. But if it's just like, this wasn't right as a marriage, but we're still friends, that is a big part of law. So, uh, Justine, I want to ask you, you're a therapist, and I think sometimes people have like a concern or worry about therapy. And I often think that people should be in therapy or at least some kind of coaching when they go through this. So, can you talk a little bit about how therapy can help? I mean, therapy can also be like a problem, but I can talk about that like in a minute, like this. But I think that what I'd like to ask you about is how do therapists work with people going through divorce in order to help them manage some of these emotional experiences?
Absolutely. I think first of all, it helps you process all of the thoughts, all of the emotions, every feeling that comes up with someone that's unbiased, right? If you're a woman and you're going through a divorce and you're calling your mother about it, your mother's going to be very biased about this, or your father, or your best friend, right? Or your sister. A therapist is unbiased, right? And they look at the full picture. They're more objective. So you also have to be open to hearing hard things about yourself too, to say, well, maybe if you continue to communicate this way with your ex, you're going to keep getting that outcome. Maybe we need to change the way you communicate. So it's not all just you come in and you're talking badly about your ex and venting it out. You could do that with your sister or your friends. A therapist is going to give you the space to vent, but also help you be constructive and say, is this reaction, is this pattern, is this cycle with your ex really helpful? How can you change? I want to focus on the person. And most of my clients come in wanting that feedback. Help me change this cycle that's going on. Help me be a better parent in this divorce. Help me do this, that, and the other. So it's, you get an objective opinion, you get tools and strategies around how to communicate better, how to have conflict better. There's going to be conflict. How can you have effective conflict without all that aggression and the name calling and the criticism? How can it be productive conflict? You're also going to learn how to manage your emotions, how to emotionally regulate yourself, right? Going through a divorce, you could go from 0 to 100 with depression, with anxiety, with anger. So you start to use those tools in the session, outside of the session, when you're communicating with your partner or your kids or your in-laws about all of this. And it helps you figure out some boundaries that you might need to put in place to protect your mental health throughout all of this.
I think that's really great because a lot of people think, well, therapy, that's lying down on the couch and talking about when I got potty trained. And what you're talking about is really effective tools to help you manage yourself better in
Yeah.
situations that you can impact. I'm not going to say control, but that your participation is a key part of it. And even though you feel like, oh my God, that person is such a jerk, or they flew here on a broomstick, and there's nothing I can do. I think what you're saying is that there's a lot you can do to
Yeah.
influence that situation, that interaction, but also influence your own response to it and how you feel about it. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, a lot of people, if you don't share anything like kids or and it could be clean and you're goodbye and you never have to talk to this person again, it can be a little bit easier to go through, like, I don't have to be accountable anymore for this person. But when you're tied through children, I feel like a lot of people have a level of denial of, like, I don't want to deal with this person ever again. We are divorced, and I hate to tell them we got to figure out a way to deal with them because they're really not going to just disappear for the most part. They're a co-parent, and every situation's different, but I have to help this person and figure out the tools. All right, I got to accept the fact that this is a person I'm going to see. This is a person I'm going to share life events with through our kids. I want that for my kids, right? So how do I learn how to deal with that? And in the beginning, a lot of people are angry and they just want to push it all away. But once they settle, once they emotionally regulate, most people are open to the idea of, like, okay, if I'm going to see this person every birthday party for the next 18 years, I have to figure out a way to kind of cope with them in the room. So they're playing with these tools.
I'm Katherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce-related topics so everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Justine Carino about divorce and mental health and therapy, and how therapy can help people going through the divorce cope better and adjust to a new life on the other side of divorce. But also, we've been talking about children, right? We've been talking about the impact of divorce on children. So, can you talk a little bit about, and I think a lot of people thinking about divorce think, well, I'm going to wait for the kids to get older because they're worried about the impact of the divorce on the kids. In my experience, children of divorce can be just as successful as children of intact families, and sometimes more successful if their parents are teaching them through their actions successful ways of dealing with conflict and what a successful relationship does and does not look like. So, Justine, can you talk a little bit about the impact of divorce on children and what you think about what I just said?
I totally agree with you. I think, back in the day, we used to try and keep families together. Research has found it's not really about mom and dad being together that has an impact on the child's emotional development. It's how the parents actually treat each other, whether or not they're together, right? I rather see two parents divorce and learn how to co-parent effectively than stay together and fight and yell and scream and triangulate their children and create this really unhealthy environment. So it's really not about whether or not the parents are together, right? And I hear that from a lot of families. They say, I'm afraid how this will impact my kids. And I say, look how it already is. Your child has an anxiety disorder because of the stuff going on, this conflict for the past 15 years, right? Actually, you might really bring some relief if you guys lived in separate homes and your kid could spend one-on-one time with a healthy parent that's happy. So kids want their parents to be together. Of course they do. And kids will subconsciously act in ways to keep them together. I've seen, it's classic textbook, like the teenager, middle schooler acting out. Well, they're acting out because the only time they might see their parents get on the same page is when they discipline them, right? So there's these subconscious ways that kids will try and get their parents to stay together, or when they are separated or divorced, they're acting out at one parent's house, and then the parent calls the ex and says, come over, I need your help. I need you to help me discipline this child or parent this child. Subconsciously, that kid's seeing their parents come back together. So naturally, yeah, we want our parents together. But if we're talking about the long-term impact, children of divorce can be extremely successful, can be extremely happy. Again, with what you're saying, Katherine, as long as we're coaching them through it, we're having conversations, we're correcting negative patterns, we learn how to communicate. Our template is what we're modeled when we grow up: how to solve conflict, how to problem solve, how to have boundaries, how to emotionally regulate. Our parents are that template for us. And sometimes we could be better models when we're not with our partner anymore. And that can set our kid up for success.
When I was thinking about getting divorced and my kids were really young, I was thinking that I really didn't want them to grow up thinking that my marriage to my first husband was what marriage should be. And that was actually a real motivator for me to end that marriage, because I wanted them to see if it was possible. And I'm remarried, and I've been married to my second husband for 25 years. So I think it is possible, what a successful marriage looks like, and including successful conflict resolution when you disagree, and it's inevitable that you do, and all of that stuff through the vicissitudes of life. So I think that's a really important thing. But also, there are extended families involved, right? And it's not the years ago, and for people who've listened to a lot of episodes here, they've heard me talk about this before, but I went on a cruise years ago with my family, and on the cruise was this family celebrating the divorce of this woman who was the in-law, right? So the husband's family went with the ex-sister-in-law, daughter-in-law, to celebrate the divorce from their own blood family member.
Wow.
And that's a pretty unusual thing. Usually there's a sort of awkwardness, and this is true for friends too, right? Like
Oh,
this,
yeah.
like, we've had a relationship with this person for years, decades. They're part of our family. They've been to all of these events. They're the aunt and uncle to the other siblings' kids. And like, how should extended families think about that? And what should divorcing people, is there a should about that, Justine Carino?
Yeah, I think the in-laws have a sense of loss too, right? They were there for it all. Maybe you're going through a divorce and your parents, were there every step of the way, watching you and your partner meet, get engaged, host a wedding perhaps, have these children together, have these roles. So for them, this is a huge loss, and they go through their stages of grief as well, right? But they need to know their boundaries. They have to try and be as mature as possible around this, because your ex-daughter-in-law or ex-son-in-law will probably also be in your life forever. And we need to learn how to have all of these relationships remain as healthy as possible with some boundaries, right? And the boundaries you have to work out, you and your ex, right? And then you can relay the message to the in-laws, right? You could say, Mom, get off his back about this. Do me a favor. When he drops the kids off, just say hello and goodbye, right? Sometimes we need to coach our extended family members on how to behave, how we want them to behave. Some parents might say, I'm going to give them a piece of my mind. I'm going to write a letter. I'm going to call them not appropriate, not necessary. And that also forms a triangle between partner A, partner B, and a parent. We don't need that triangle. That becomes an unhealthy dynamic. We want to keep the conflict between the two people that are divorcing, and everyone else has to try to be supportive, mature, emotionally regulated, with some boundaries.
We're talking about boundaries, and I think that's a really interesting idea, right? That the idea of setting boundaries, like, well, Justine Carino, what do you mean by boundaries?
Yeah, so boundaries are these visible, individual lines that we create, right, to protect ourselves and to protect a relationship, right? So a physical boundary is you can't touch me, hands to yourself. We teach that to toddlers. Keep your hands to yourself. Ask permission, right? Ask permission to hug. So there's physical boundaries, but there's also emotional boundaries. And we really put these in place to actually preserve a relationship. When there's loose boundaries, it could be a problem. And when there's very strict, rigid boundaries, it could also be a problem. We want something somewhere in the middle where both people can somewhat feel good about it. But this preserves the relationship between two people because there's less resentment. We start to resent people when they constantly cross our boundaries, and then that leads to an explosion, that leads to a conflict, that leads to a fight, and that leads to a lot of anger between the people. So if we want to have a good relationship with our ex, we do have to think about what boundaries we need to put in place, but we also have to respect their boundaries, right? We have to say, okay, I get it. This is what they need to do. I'm thinking of a client, she kept putting her boundaries in place with her ex. And then one day the ex put one in with her and said, you know what, I'm leaving this family group chat, not my place to be in this anymore. And she was very upset. And I said, well, you know what, that's his boundary. He's not wrong about that. There's no need for him to participate in this family group chat. So we need to respect the boundaries of both sides, because when we do, you actually will get along a lot better.
Do you think that because I think that people get into trouble when the boundaries aren't really clear. They're not explicit, right? They're just assumed, well, he should know better than that. She should know that this, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that upsets me because blah, blah, blah. And so I think that when people are getting divorced or in any situation like that where there's conflict, there's tension, that in order to use the boundary to de-escalate it, making an explicit list of rules, right? This is how we're going to communicate with each other. This is when we're going to communicate with each other. We're going to text. We're going to use an app like our Family Wizard or Two Houses or something like that. Or we're only going to communicate between 5 and 7 or whatever it is. And I think that's something that a therapist can help with, because I think that people don't necessarily know how to take those things that make them uncomfortable and make them into a rule or a boundary that is not personal to the other person. Well, I don't like it when you do this. Like, how do you make that don't like it when you do this into a request for them to do something that doesn't sound like blame? Does that make
Yeah,
sense to you?
absolutely. Well, it's so simple, and it's the same thing I use in couples therapy, right? And it's this statement, we call it a gentle startup, and I'm actually pulling it from the Gottmans. I don't know if anyone's heard of the researchers, the Gottmans. They research a lot of conflict in couples, and there's a gentle startup, and it's basically, how do I approach a conflict and set a boundary effectively? And it's so simple. We've all heard it 1,000 times. It's the I feel. I felt really upset when you showed up at my house outside of the time I expected. This was my private time. Going forward, you have to call or text if you want to come over to pick something up, right? So you're saying how you felt. I felt uncomfortable. I felt upset. I felt surprised. I felt angry. I felt violated, right? How you feel, because you're not going to criticize the other person. You want to, but if you criticize them, they're going to get defensive, blow up in 2 seconds. So you put it on you. I felt very uncomfortable when you came unannounced. I know this used to be your home, but we're living separately now. In the future, I need you to text me ahead of time, call ahead of time, only show up on this day and time, whatever it may be. And the other person, you can't expect them to be happy about it. They're probably going to get mad and say, damn it, I wish I could still show up when I want. But that's their work to figure out. And then there's that conversation. So just by starting with the I feel, instead of you did this and I'm pissed about it, that eliminates the opportunity for conflict from the beginning.
I think that's great advice. You're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Katherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years. Subscribe to the podcast, and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. I'm talking today with Justine Carino about mental health and divorce. And Justine, if people are interested in learning more about you and your practice, how can they do that?
Absolutely. My website is carinocounseling.com. I can do therapy for people that are living in New York and Connecticut, but I also provide coaching to anyone, anywhere, and that looks a little bit differently. But anyone's welcome to reach out and have a consult and see if me or any of the women that work with me are a good fit.
That's great. You know, Justine Carino, I have found over the years, and I've been doing this a really long time, that people are anxious, depressed, like we were talking about at the top of the show, and that it really impacts their ability to take on their lives, right? Like I'll have people who've been successful business people or successful doctors, lawyers, and they're really having trouble functioning in that role. And so, in your experience, how do you see the stress of divorce impacting people's everyday functioning?
I mean, it's tremendous. I think it's really up there with the traumatic life events for people, right? It's a traumatic time to say, I no longer want to be married to this person that I've created my entire life and existence around for the past 10, 15, 30 something years, right? So with my own parents, they divorced right before I was going to get married. Thanks, mom and dad. And they were together about 30 something years, right? And it was like, holy crap, even as an adult child, I'm saying goodbye to my childhood home that they decided to sell. There's pieces of you that get impacted. And I saw both of their lives for 30 something years together have to untangle. It can be debilitating. It can turn your life upside down. It could be difficulty getting to work. It could be difficulty wanting to socialize. It could be difficulty, just being yourself. You miss your own old self. And with that, we have to constantly assess how debilitating is it. Get yourself to therapy, talk to a mental health professional, because they will assess, is this like an adjustment disorder to what's going on? And we give it some time and tools and coping mechanisms. Is this a diagnosable mental health condition that we want to pull in some medication temporarily to get the person functioning again? So there's so many options on how to help those symptoms once they emerge. But I want to validate for people, a divorce can trigger a depressive episode. It could trigger an anxiety disorder. It can trigger old stuff you didn't even know you were dealing with that come to the surface, right? When we think of mental health, we're all just predisposed somehow, right? It's in our DNA if we had a family member that struggled with anxiety or depression. And sometimes it just takes a life event to trigger those genes to turn on. And before you know it, we have generalized anxiety, we have major depression, but all of those things are so treatable, which is the good news.
As you're talking about it, Justine Carino, I'm thinking if you had a cold, you'd take an Advil, right? Or if you had an allergy, you'd take a Claritin. And the idea of treating something that comes on because it's you're having an episode of something doesn't make you crazy. It
No.
doesn't make you somehow less than because it may be a permanent issue that you need to deal with, but it may not be. And that sometimes people self-medicate by drinking a lot or, smoking a lot of marijuana or other things.
Yes,
Other things that are about like somehow dealing with the stress and the anxiety of going through this really difficult time. And when the difficult time is over, they're like fine, like they can
yes.
readjust to normal life and getting some help, treatment, whether or not it's talk therapy or medication or something else that allows you to deal with it better. I mean, I was just talking to a guy last week. He goes, well, to tell you the truth, I just started taking Wellbutrin and I'm feeling a lot more organized. Like these are my words, but it's like I was actually able to deal with a lot of the sort of like stress and outside stresses in a way that really makes sense for me. And having this little bit of medication like help
Yeah.
me make that choice. And so I think that can really be a useful way to think about it.
And it doesn't have to be forever. I can't tell you. Most of my clients come in and maybe I see them a year to 2 years. I'm thinking about divorce clients, a year to 2 years, because they learn the effective coping mechanisms. Maybe we bring in a medication as well to treat it, and they get through it, and then they decide to slowly come off the medication. Maybe if they want to, they don't have to, and then they've learned their skills and they go on their merry way. You can be in therapy all of your life if you want. Sure, that's great, but you don't have to be. Usually, there's an adjustment period where you adapt to this life transition. You sort things out, you learn how to cope, and then you're good. And maybe you come back for a check in a few months, or I'm here if something else comes up that you need to talk about, come on back. But for the most part, if you go to therapy, it doesn't mean you're there for the rest of your life.
All right, we're almost out of time, Justine Carino, but I do want to ask you, what are some of the most common misconceptions about the emotional process of divorce that you come across in your practice?
Yeah, I see a lot of people assume that they'll never have a good relationship with their ex, right? And I see that, get disproven, right? I think that they think I'll never get over this, I'll never recover. This divorce ruined my life, and I promise them, you will be okay, and you will see the other side of this. And this actually could be the best thing that might have happened to you and your ex and your children if you had it. Let's figure this out, right? So there's also the misconception like no one will want to be with me in the future because of this. I got 5 kids and I'm single. I've seen every limiting belief get disproven. Right. I had one woman going through divorce and she was pregnant and she said, no one's going to be interested in me. And then the next week she came back, you won't believe it. I was getting my nails done and a man was hitting on me and I'm not visibly pregnant and going through a divorce. I said, limiting belief, right? We always make these limiting beliefs. This will never happen. I'll never be wanted. I'll never be the same. You will. Your life will be upside down for a little bit, but you'll get back there. And maybe actually this new version of you that emerges after all of this is actually a better version of you that you didn't expect coming.
Oftentimes I'll say to my clients, all right, so call me please before you get married again. They go like, I'm not even dating, Catherine. I'm never going to date again. 2 years later, they call me and they're like, so you're never going to believe it. I'm like, yes, I am absolutely going to believe it because I know what the process is. And there is definitely for many people a place of like, that's it. I'm going to be, but for better or for worse, I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life. I'm never going to put myself at risk like that again. But
Yeah.
then, they do because they want to. And
Yeah,
and that's a sort of normal process of recovery.
absolutely. Never say never.
Right. Well, Justine Carino, it has been my absolute pleasure to have you as my guest on Divorce Dialogues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine.
"49 Faces looked to him in triumph. Over the last 12 months, they had each taken turns and promoted his business for a week at a time, driving over $987,342 in revenue. What if you had a network of 50 centers of influence who promoted your business every week for a year? Grab your copy of the #1 Amazon best-selling book, The Ultimate Guide to Growing Your Business with a Podcast, at 33% off the Amazon price by going to ultimatepodcastbook.com. Again, that website for 33% off the Amazon price is ultimatepodcastbook.com.